So, India just witnessed its biggest GST shake-up since 2017.
The Honorable Prime Minister actually set the tone for the next generation reforms on the 15th of August when he spoke from the Red Fort.
हम नेक्स्ट जनरेशन जीएसटी रिफॉर्म्स लेकर के आ रहे हैं। ये दिवाली के अंदर आपके लिए तोहफा बन जाएंगे।
So, the previous 4 tax slabs under GST are gone. We now have just 2, 5% and 18%, plus a new 40% for sin and luxury goods. What does it mean? Cheaper soaps, shampoos, small cars, TVs, and even cement. It also means costlier cigarettes, luxury cars, and private jets. The GST Council has also promised faster refunds, fixes to inverted tax structures, and clarity on input tax credits, especially for businesses holding old credits when exemptions or new rates kick in. This is supposed to boost consumption and, according to experts, also the economy by up to 0.5 percentage points in 2 years. But here are the key questions. When do the benefits of this new structure reach you and me? September 22nd, as has been announced, or much later? Do compliances and filing processes actually become easier and cheaper, especially for GST-troubled MSMEs? What is the real revenue implication for the government? The estimated amount of 48,000 crore rupees or more? Will it make exports more efficient? If so, how? Will it ease the center-state tussle over revenue share or increase them as the pie becomes smaller for many states and disproportionately larger for consumption-heavy regions? We try and answer all this and more in today's episode. I'm your host Anirban Chowdhury. This is the Morning Brief. My guest today is Bipin Sapra, partner, leader, Indirect Tax and Economic Policy at EY. I started by asking him his biggest takeaways from this rejig. Let's start with your biggest takeaways and also why now?
Okay. My biggest takeaway is that there was a need for GST to be simplified, rationalized, and new avatar of GST to be created, which would be move on from what was there initially and what had been achieved in the last 8 years. Accordingly, this was the apt time where the revenues had grown and there was buoyancy in the revenues. There were issues which the people were facing, and accordingly, this seemed to be the opportune time to do these reforms.
So the biggest question in everyone's minds now is when or how soon will the benefits of this actually reach the taxpayer? And also, do you see any challenges therein?
See, the intent of the government is that by 22nd September, the industry should be ready to pass on these benefits to the customers. So ultimately, the boost which will happen to the consumption, that will fuel the demand, which will bring about the economic growth. Now, in reality, there are issues which can be a dampener, which could be the amount of benefit which the people can pass on. There would be issues around pricing, around what is lying on stock. And then there would be issues like in case of automobiles where the compensation cess credits would be lying with the dealers and would not have been passed on. There is no clarity as to how these would get subsumed into the main GST. So there would be costs which would have been there in the transitional time, which would require to be settled so that the benefit could be passed on as early as possible by the industry.
But do you have another sort of timeline in mind beyond September 22nd, Bipin?
So there will not be a fixed timeline as such. So if we look at various sectors, the FMCG, the food product sector, the textiles, and the other consumable items which are going to be there where rates have reduced, those people, given the constraint in the supply, will take some time to pass on these benefits. From a compensation cess levied products, where the compensation cess will cease along with the increase in rates, like the aerated waters and the automobiles.
Would you explain what the compensation cess and the issue around it is?
The compensation cess is levied on only certain items, and they have been levied on articles which were today at a rate of 28%. These were items which were generally in the nature of either luxury or in the nature of sin goods, or products like tobacco, etc., which would need to be modified. Now, that compensation says the credit, whatever was being paid by the manufacturer and the goods were being sold to the dealers, the GST was fully creditable and the compensation cess was creditable against the compensation cess liability only. When
Okay.
compensation cess gets phased out, when the GST rate increases, everything else will be creditable from a GST perspective, but the compensation cess balance is lying with the dealers or even with the manufacturer in case of sales return. There would be no avenue to liquidate those credits. And these would be substantial number of credits. And this will be across sectors like automobiles and the luxury automobiles, the aerated beverages. Even coal would have some amount of compensation cess. So whatever is in store along the supply chain, there should be a refund mechanism of that going forward, or they may be allowed to be subsumed within the GST, and that credit should be allowed to be utilized towards paying of GST. But for that,
Understood.
a law needs to be created and cannot be done within the present set of law.
Now, apart from what I already mentioned, what becomes cheaper? Packaged food like namkeens, sauces, instant noodles, pasta, cornflakes, chocolates, preserved meat, dairy and breads, personal care items, household articles, stationery, bicycles, tractors, tractor tires, forestry machines, biopesticides, 33 life-saving drugs, 3 rare cancer disease medicines, medical apparatus like diagnostic kits, glucometers, and bandages. What remains unchanged? Electric vehicles and, critically, services. Here's Bipin.
See, what is very clear is that certain items would definitely benefit. And I'll start from the list of 28% articles because that's being talked about lesser than the articles at 12 and 18% today. Consumer electronics, say air conditioners, washing machines, they are today at 28%. They go to 18%. Construction industry, cement today is at 28%. That goes to 18%. Small cars are today at 28%. They go to 18%. So sectors like these are going to benefit a lot. Similarly, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, textiles, all of these are going to really benefit, given that ultimately the benefit of reduced rate would get passed on and the consumption needs to would go higher up in these cases.
So, when India rolled out GST in 2017, it promised to replace a tangled web of state and central levies with one nation, one tax. But in reality, it turned into a maze. The real headache was the input tax credit. The system meant to prevent double taxation, but here's how it played out. In some sectors, inputs were taxed higher than the final product. Imagine paying 18% GST on yarn, but only 5% on the cloth you wove from it. The refund process was painfully slow, locking up tens of thousands of crores in working capital and in piled up and unpaid refunds. The government claims to have resolved all of this with the latest set of reforms. But has it?
See, on the face of it, a lot of inputs have been rationalized so that the output taxes on them would benefit. What you need to realize is that as items move down to 5%, the services continue to be at 18, The capital goods continue to be at 18. And there is a structural inverted duty which might be there, especially for capex incentive products. So there needs to be an evaluation in terms of how inverted duties are now looking at. And more importantly, it may not be inverted duty in the classical sense, what we understand from the law, but in terms of what will be leading to accumulation of credits because the rates have gone down and the other rates continue to remain higher. So a lot of work has been done. The intent has been to reduce as far as possible, but the structure of the GST itself is such, given that the services and the capital goods continue to remain at 18, that there would be some amount of inverted duties getting created in these sectors.
All right. Okay. Now, the impact on the government coffers with two slabs, 5% and 18%. What do you think will be the realistic impact on GST collections, say over the next 2 quarters? And I mean, the government has roughly quantified 48,000 crore, but is there more nuance to it that the listener needs to understand?
See, revenue implication, as was being talked about in the press conference yesterday, is something which there would be an impact. The government has talked about a number of 48,000. We do not know the exact basis of that. There would be a very different calculation which each of these states would be carrying. And I'm very sure that the sum of those would definitely be higher than 48,000. What we feel is that there is a revenue loss, and the number may or may not be higher than what the government has shown, because there might also be taxes which are not visible to us, but which the government may have realized and would have incorporated the increase because of that, in terms of the buoyancy which would come in. Anyway, I think whatever reduction happens in the next 2 quarters, so I think the first quarter revenue collections would go down, but they should pick up as we go along in the second quarter and beyond that. It all depends upon how strong is the elasticity, how soon is the industry able to pass on those benefits, and that money will again be used back into the economy to buy new products. So it's a self-fueling thing, and the earlier the industry is able to pass on, given whatever constraints they have in terms of the transitional period, that would determine as to how much revenue shortfall effectively would happen in maybe the second quarter, and how soon the revenue fall would pick up and move towards the increase.
Okay, so is compliance easier and cheaper, especially for MSMEs who have really been bearing the brunt of it?
So, couple of things change. There's been some simplification in the GST returns, but more importantly, the registration has been made very simpler. That would help MSMEs to get registration very quickly. There have been delays in getting registration. A lot of refunds would now be given provisionally without waiting for the exact calculations. And that should be a big help to the MSMEs, especially where inverted duties are getting created and there was no recourse earlier and working capital was getting impacted. So those are things which would help from a compliance perspective more and more MSMEs to join the formalization process.
But working capital would be unlocked not just for MSMEs, but overall, right?
Yes, because one, the inverted duty structures are being rectified. There is the other processes of getting refunds, registration, returns, everything is being simplified. All of these would definitely help in unlocking the capital which is held up and help the working capital requirements of the industry.
Right. The other aspect that it would really benefit is, of course, exports, and there is a cloud over Indian exports, especially in industries like textiles, etc., which sell heavily to the US, and we all know the tariff story. How would that story change, even if a little bit? How would Indian exports become more competitive?
See, I think whatever products are being manufactured today, some amount of tax continues to remain embedded. There is no 100% efficiency when it comes to credits. And accordingly, whatever amount gets added to the cost of the goods is a deterrent from both perspective. It makes products costlier. Getting most of the products down to 5% or reducing the rates of a lot of products would help reduce the cost of manufacturing in the country And accordingly, a lot of amount which was getting stuck on these goods which were being exported, there should be a reduction and they should be more competitive in the global markets. So that would help. That's one part of the thing. The second part, which is quite strong, is that the government has done away with the concept of intermediary. Accordingly, all intermediaries, which are service providers, which could be in the nature of commission agents, even all the entire ITS service providers, there were a lot of disputes because of some glitches in the contracts or some misinterpretations. All of that is going to go away immediately. And that's a huge positive for the exporting industry, that their cost, which was getting built up, is going to come down. And that's a big move from the government side.
Then comes political economy. Now, GST has always been a tug of war between Delhi and the states. With revenues now expected to dip in the short run, states are watching closely. The larger consumption states will eventually gain when demand picks up, but in the interim, they would want compensation. Well, the fact that all states signed up for this shows rare consensus, but the real test will come when collections start dipping. Here's Bipin.
The center state relations have always been tricky in any federal setup. More so in India, where states have become as important and governments have been more representative of the state governments. There are revenue shortfalls which these states would be seeing, and they would be looking at short term compensation from the center to really get them through those quarters where the initial revenue may be a shortfall. That needs to be looked at.
Right. Two final questions. Do you think two slabs is the end game, or do you foresee India, eventually moving to, say, a single rate GST? I think many other countries, like the OECD countries, have done that.
The two rate structure moving to a one rate, it may happen at some point of time. That's the way to go for the Indian economy and follow the best practices across. The problem is that given the nature of Indian economy, two rate structure reduces the possibility of inflation in the economy. And hence, essentially, the initial proposal was to have a two rate structure somewhere around one a merit rate and the other at a more standard rate.
Right.
But today's rates, with the 12% being phased out, the gap between 5% and 18% is substantial.
Right.
And that may need to be structured once these set of reforms settle down. The government may want to look at bringing these slabs closer together so that there would be a better representative taxation and much lesser evasion.
Understood. And Bipin, being a tax and trade veteran yourself, would you have done these reforms slightly differently, and how would it be different?
See, I think the government has got it absolutely right this time. They have done whatever was possible. We hadn't anticipated that big a change. There would always be some changes, things which can be done better in terms of inverted duty structures, in terms of similar items continuing to remain at a higher rate while items which are similar come down at the lower rate. Looking at sector-wise impact of services remaining at 18, capital goods, how to look at all of that. So there would be some areas which could have been done better if there was more time and more dialogue with the industry. But my view is that I think this is still a first big step, and the second step will happen sooner than later. There are other reforms which the government is looking at, which was the part of GST 2.0, which included audit rationalization in terms of how the audits are being conducted, credit rationalization, how credits are being passed on, where the credits are being stopped, and the criminalization of offenses. So there is still work to do. There is still things to do, but a great job done till now. I don't think there is too much to ask at this stage by the industry.
Bipin, thank you so much for joining us on the Morning Brief.
Thank you, Anirban, for having me. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
So, GST 2.0 is about cheaper goods, but it's also about clearing almost a decade of sludge, cost, compliances, and compensations. The success of this will depend on how quickly beneficiary companies pass on its benefits, how states are kept happy, and how soon businesses and consumers feel the relief on ground. That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. It was produced by me and Vinay Joshi, sound designed by Amrit Reddy. A new episode of The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our brand new show, Corner Office Conversation, where we talk to the most interesting business leaders from India and the world every alternate Monday, wherever you get your podcasts. Keep listening. The external clips used in this episode belong to their owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.